Is damage attribute worth using? The short answer, yes. The long answer, it depends on which attribute you are actually damaging. First, let's address the cost. Damage attribute costs the same as damage health or damage magicka. 100 points of damage attribute on touch costs 80 magicka. In comparison to that, 100 points of frost damage on touch costs 50 magicka. This may sound expensive, but keep in mind that enemies are unlikely to have more than 100 in any attribute, and they are fairly likely to have less. Of course, there are exceptions like Gaenor. Also, Bretons and Orcs are going to resist part of the spell, so it's not going to be as effective on them. But even if you don't reduce an attribute to 0, you will still be permanently weakening your enemy. Which attribute is most worth targeting? Damage strength is usually a good idea because all weapon damage is increased by strength. So lowering strength will decrease how hard the enemy hits, although the damage is also dependent on the weapon. Please note that hand-to-hand damage and damage by any creature melee attacks are not affected by strength. If you reduce enemy strength to 0, they will be unable to move, unless they have literally no weight in their inventory. In that regard, damage strength is a big threat to the player as well, since players usually carry a lot of stuff. So beware the greater bonewalkers. Damage intelligence is useful against mages. 0 intelligence means 0 magicka. Of course, that's not useful if the enemy is not a mage, and it doesn't affect enchantments or powers. Brain damage makes a pretty awful mage. I'm sure you know all about that. Damage willpower is useful if you want to use paralyze or silence and the enemies keep resisting it. Keep in mind that vampires have a 100% resistance to paralysis, so using damage willpower on vampires therefore doesn't change anything, but you can still use silence. It also reduces their ability to successfully cast spells, but if their magic skills are very high, this might not do much. Damaging agility will reduce enemy hit chance and decrease their ability to dodge your attacks. Again, if their weapon skill is very high, even reducing their agility to 0 won't do much. Damaging speed will make enemies move slower. It just makes NPCs move a bit more slowly, while creatures look like they've been caught by a black hole. I mean, just look at them. It apparently won't work on underwater creatures because of a bug. Damage endurance won't affect enemy health, but it will reduce their rate of fatigue regeneration. If you reduce their endurance to 0, they don't actually stop regenerating it, but the rate is the slowest possible. I know this because I reduced my own endurance to 0 and fatigue still kept increasing. But I could no longer regain it by resting or using the wait button, only by physically waiting in front of the screen did it go up. You can then combine this slowed regeneration with damage and drain fatigue to knock them on the ground, and then laugh at them as they've fallen and can't get up. Damage personality is by far the most useless of these. I suppose it might make it easier to haggle or persuade an NPC, but damage attribute is a hostile spell, so you'll have to calm them down afterwards and potentially pay off a bounty. But even for that purpose it might not be very effective, because the skills of Speechcraft and Mercantile are significantly more important for that than the attribute governing them. You'd be better off if you just raised your own personality instead, though I know that that's very hard for you to do. And lastly, damaging luck should make an NPC overall slightly worse at everything, both magic and combat. But again, if their relevant skill is very high, it won't have a very large effect. Even smaller than willpower and agility. But you can combine damage luck with either damage agility or willpower for a greater effect, though honestly, at that point you'd be better off just using damage strength. One extra thing that I should mention is that your maximum fatigue is calculated by combining the values of strength plus willpower plus agility plus endurance. Damaging one of these attributes will lower enemy maximum fatigue. But if you ensure that an enemy has 0 in each of these 4 stats, they will be left with 0 out of 0 fatigue, which also means no regeneration of it. The first action that they do that uses fatigue will make them collapse on the ground, with no chance to get back up. Well, at least until 72 in-game hours have passed, after which NPCs reset, if they are still alive. So it seems to me that the big winner here is damage strength, with most of the others also being fairly good in certain situations. But the worst one is personality, of course. What about Oblivion? In Oblivion, the damage attribute cannot be obtained in spell form, unless you use console commands, because there's no spell available in-game. But it can be found on pre-enchanted weapons and arrows, and also on scrolls. You can also create your own damage attribute potions. However, the effects of both existing items as well as potions you can create yourself are somewhat limited in magnitude. Which is why, for maximum effect, you might want to first soften up the target with the use of weakness to magic or weakness to poison spells if using poison. In Oblivion, strength is very similar to Morrowind. It affects how much you can carry, and it affects the damage you can do with the majority but not all weapons. So if the enemy is using hand-to-hand or melee weapons, you can reduce their damage by damaging their strength. In Oblivion Remastered, strength no longer affects daggers and short swords, which it previously did, because those are now affected by agility instead. Intelligence affects how much magicka you have, but that's only for you, the player. According to the wiki, you can't reduce NPC magicka by lowering their intelligence. If this is true, there is no point in making damage intelligence poisons. Willpower affects magicka regeneration. If you use damage willpower, you will slow it down. However, even reducing willpower to 0 will not stop it. It'll just be twice as slow as it is at 50. Agility increases damage done by bows. It also makes you stagger less and your enemy more. In Remastered, it says it affects your fatigue regeneration, although even reducing agility to 0 did not remove it when I tested that. And also damage done by daggers and short swords as mentioned when I was talking about strength. So if your enemy is using one of those weapons affected, or you just want to have an easier time in melee combat by making your enemy stagger instead of yourself, use damage agility. Damage speed can apparently prevent enemies from moving at all if their speed is reduced to 0, like with damage strength. As for endurance, damaging your own endurance decreases your total health, but it does nothing against NPC health. Or at least that's how it was in 2006 Oblivion. I am not sure if that has changed in Remastered, but if anyone knows, you can write it down in the comments. If it hasn't changed, then you'd best just sell off your damage endurance poisons instead of using them. There seems to be no point in damaging enemy personality, when you could be doing literally anything else to them. And damaging luck will make your enemy overall a bit worse than they were in terms of skills, but maybe you should use something with greater effects first. If you want to know how good damage magicka is, see this video next. Thanks for watching.